Hi, I'm Micah Clark. Thank you for joining us today with American Family Association. I have a great friend on today who's written a book, but you may know his name because he is a Hoosier at heart and by a long time association. He worked for Senator Dan Coates. That's where I first met Tim Goeglein. He was a speechwriter and a policy expert for the senator. I've known Tim for a long time. I just recently saw him at an event for the Indiana Family Institute where he promoted and talked about his new book, and I thought, our people need to know about this. This is a phenomenal book. It's called Stumbling Toward Utopia. Now, Tim's written several books kind of along this line. This is the first one I've read. It's just recently came out, and it's an outstanding book. As you can see, it's not very big, but I've highlighted many things in it. I've got sticky notes in it. So much good stuff, good content in this. And I so enjoyed Tim's talk at IFI's dinner that I went to with about 25 of their supporters, and it was great to see Tim, my friend, back in Indiana. But his book just really caught my attention, and I finished it today. It's a phenomenal book called Stumbling Towards Utopia. Remember that, because I want you to get this book, because this really hits what the American Family Association of Indiana is all about. But Tim, it's great to have you on. Good to see you, my friend.
It's such a pleasure to be with you, Micah. A real blessing.
Well, I know the reason behind this book kind of came from a question, and you started out your talk with this question, and then you just went for about 25 minutes. And if that's what you want to do, I'd love to hear that again. If not, I'll throw questions in. But the question that you started off to talk about with your book is a question I've gotten, you've gotten, and that is from people who remember the past. What in the world has happened to America? And maybe I'll just throw that out there. What in the world has happened? And that might be the reason why you wrote this book. So take it from there and tell us maybe why you wrote the book. And then let's get into that question. What has happened?
Well, first, I'm really honored to have you ask that question off the top, because every author loves to be asked, why did you spend your time, doing this? And I travel about a third of the time in my role as one of the vice presidents that focus on the family. Unlike most of my colleagues who are based in Colorado Springs, I live and work in the swamp and have done so, for going on 4 decades. First at the White House, then in the U.S., first in the Senate, then at the White House, now at Focus on the Family. And at Focus, as I say, I travel a lot, and I found myself in Tulsa, Oklahoma, about 3 years ago after a speech. And I thought, I've been asked a question now what seemed like 1,000 times, Micah. And the question was, how in the world did our country get into this mess? And I thought to myself, I've been asked that question often enough. I'm going to get on the airplane. Once we're airborne, I'm going to ask a steward for, I think, what are the smallest napkins in the history of the United States, that stack of small cocktail napkins. And I began to scratch out what became the outline of the book you're holding, Stumbling Toward Utopia. And what I found is that if you want to answer the question, how did we get into this mess? You have to ask yourself, how in the world did we have such a moral and social revolution in the 1960s and 70s? Because, and I do mean this, all of the moral and social problems, all that we are facing today in the family, in marriages, parenting, human life, religious liberty, conscience rights, parental rights, the pronoun debate, it all stems from the 1960s and the radicalization of our country in that relatively short period of time. I speak and write at length about a few handful of figures, comparatively, Micah, who had an outsized influence on creating the 1960s and 70s. And what I found in all of my research is that if you want to ask the questions, well, how did politics change? Or how did our legal system change? Or what brought on the sexual revolution? Or when did government explode and try to replace the family and try to be so involved in education at every level? How did that actually happen? I put it all between covers in the book that you're holding. And the thing I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to make it accessible, because people who share our worldview are busy. They're busy in their marriages. They're busy in their families. raising good children, trying to protect kids from the popular culture, which, by the way, is also one of the terrible lasting influences of the 1960s, the corruption of popular culture and what we call basic wholesome entertainment. And so my goal was to answer the question, how do we get into this mess?
Mm-hmm.
But also, and I'm going to be very specific in this regard, Micah, I am an inveterate optimist. I'm not sort of like eager to be the last guy on the Titanic. And I do not think that the fate and state of the United States of America is the Titanic. I think it's quite the opposite. I think it's more like the first moonshot.
Mm-hmm.
We've got galaxies to explore in all the good years ahead for our country. But we have to understand this terrible maelstrom and cataclysm and charnel house of the moral revolution, and then learn from it, which I think we're doing already. And then we have to be systematic about saying, how do we have an American restoration? To ask ourselves the question, what kind of a country do we want 50 years from now? I think those are good questions
Mm-hmm.
to ask. And I think those of us that focus on the family, the people at AFA, I think we have a lot to say about this and a lot of good work to do.
Well, I appreciate that we often think about the 60s, and maybe Rush Limbaugh used to say, your view of history starts the day you were born. But many people don't think before they were born. I was born in 67. I know you were born a few years earlier than me. But you take it back, the 60s, you start looking at the 60s by going back to the turn of the century. People like
Yes.
Woodrow Wilson, Roger Baldwin, Margaret Sanger. Tell us about some of those influential people. Thomas Dewey is in your book, too. Start us there, and how did that lay the groundwork for what exploded in the 60s?
Yes, I spend a lot of time looking at President Woodrow Wilson, came to the presidency in 1912, governor of New Jersey, had been the
Mm-hmm.
president of Princeton. He's everything that you can imagine in a smug intellectual who believes that he has a lot to teach the American people.
Mm-hmm.
Wilson was very uncomfortable with the United States. He wanted experts to run our country. He was uncomfortable with citizen-led sovereignty, which is the concept of our founders. Very uncomfortable with the Constitution, very uncomfortable with the Declaration of
Mm-hmm.
Independence, very uncomfortable with three branches of government that check the other branches and don't give any one branch too much power. If you want to ask what happened and brought on the corruption of American politics, look no further, in my view, as a capstone than Woodrow Wilson and the founding of what became American progressivism.
Mm-hmm.
There are shards of it in many other places, but in my view, as you'll see in Stumbling Towards Utopia, the political class and progressivism really came together in Woodrow Wilson. Margaret Sanger, another notable at the turn of the century, lasting influence, the creator of the sexual revolution. She was really a great champion. I say great in air quotation marks. I really mean the worst form of,
Mm-hmm.
but a champion of abortion long before it was legal. She was a racialist. She believed in eugenics. She believed in classes of people. Some were worthy of having children, and some were not worthy of having children. And she also had a lot of views about children once they were born, and it's all troubling. And of course, the founder of Planned Parenthood, which we know has been so disastrous for
Mm-hmm.
the innocent preborn. John Dewey, very uncomfortable with American education, very well funded, a person who said, it's not about the character formation. That's not the center part of American education. It's not about the concept of the good citizen, character over intellect. It was really about the creation of the new citizen as a way of creating a new United States. By the way, that's what Wilson wanted. That's what
Mm-hmm.
Margaret Sanger wanted. That's what John Dewey wanted in education, in the sexual revolution, and the relationship between the two sexes. This is what Woodrow Wilson believed when it came to fundamentally changing the constitutional nature of our country as our framers conceived it. And a fourth person worth mentioning is Roger Baldwin.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, Micah, he was the founder, now forgotten, of the ACLU. I find the great irony in Roger Baldwin, not only that he was a communist, which is important for us to say, it explains a lot, but I think it's very important that people know that he was remarkably uncomfortable with religion and faith and the concept of justice and where justice comes from and how it's employed. And he craftily used this to recreate or to help recreate the American law and legal system, which I think explains so much of the mess that we are in today. So it's individuals like that. And may I say very quickly, they and that matrix of ideas, social engineering, the perfectibility of man, all these things that do not work and are not true. There was only one perfect man, the God man, Jesus Christ. Our fallen nature is a constant. No one is perfect. And government is not going to socially engineer any of us into perfectibility. But these people were progressives. They believed in social engineering. And as a result of these ideas, we got the terrible Great Society,
Yes.
trying to replace the family. We got the Port Huron Statement, which plays a starring role in stumbling toward utopia, the remaking of American higher education and using it as a radical truncheon against our country. And of course, in Indiana, Alfred Kinsey and Masters and Johnson and all the things that they did directly relating to the creation of the pornography industry in the United States.
Tim, one of the chapters that stuck out to me, and I honestly thought would be the chapter on the family, but it was actually the chapter before that on the Great Society that really, I think I've heard a lot of these facts and figures. I've seen a lot of them from heritage foundations and places like that. But you have these in your book. And one thing I love about the way you write, there's no fluff in this. You don't go down rabbit trails. This is a very concise book. It was hard for me to put down, but I had my highlighter out numerous times. And one of the chapters I highlighted the most was on the Great Society, because I have seen, and I think a lot of people have seen, what I guess I didn't realize. You have a stat in there. We have spent $22 trillion on the war on poverty, and poverty has either gotten worse or stagnant from where it was in 1964. In fact, poverty was going down before 1964, before the Great Society and the war on poverty. And it's not only has it made things worse, well, not only has it not helped people, it's changed our whole work ethic. And we're actually rewarding people. We're changing behaviors through a lot of welfare programs and how that affects marriage and their work ethic. Can you unpack that a little bit? Because I knew it to be true, but that chapter really had a lot of wow moments with some of the stats you have in there.
Yes, the Great Society was launched in 1964 by President Lyndon Baines Johnson at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And in preparation for Stumbling Toward Utopia, I went back and read almost all of LBJ's major speeches on the Great Society and really learned about its idea architecture, which is very much in line, frankly, with Woodrow Wilson and much of the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And what you find, Micah, as you know from reading the book, is that LBJ makes these outsized, colossal, Olympian promises in behalf of the federal government. We're going to solve poverty. We're going to solve the problems in the family. We're going to solve the race issue in America. We're going to go into areas of urban America where we've never played a role. I mean, it goes on and on. And the thing is, every politician, it seems to me, at some point, makes a promise. But when you look at the Great Society and you look at its founding and all of its promises, it is fair to say that people left and right who honestly looked at the empirical data just within a few years of its launch knew that it was impossibly flawed. You mentioned that we spent $22 trillion and climbing on poverty by 2022. And now we're in 2024. That number is undoubtedly higher. And poverty is worse than when the Great Society was launched.
Mm-hmm.
I cite a statistic in there about the fate and state of the American family. We have the
Mm-hmm.
lowest marriage rates, the lowest
Mm-hmm.
fertility rates. We have broken marriages, which is now a way of life in the United States. I think especially your viewers and listeners and supporters should be sobered by the fact that in 1960, this is only 1960, almost 75% of young people were living in a home with a married mother and father.
Mm-hmm.
By 1980, that number was down to barely half. And 2015, that number is like approaching 41%. I mean, we know for a fact that when government, the federal government, local government, regional government, when they incentivize the breaking up of marriage, when
Mm-hmm.
they incentivize the breaking up of parenting, responsibility, all the things that go into cohesiveness in a community, we get more of it because that's what government ultimately says that it is going to reward. And we have to be very wary, even today, of these lingering Great Society radical revolution promises that are really ripping into our social cohesiveness
Mm-hmm.
and the fabric and tapestry that is this remarkable and extraordinary constitutional republic.
One of the stats in there that I've seen before was that 4 out of 5 children who live with a single parent are either at or below the poverty level. And yet,
Yes.
when you look at black families who are married with a married mother and father, only 10% of those children are at the poverty level or below. And that's the thing. We hear a lot about race, we hear a lot about economics, but I think the biggest thing in our society between the haves and the have-nots is marriage, is the presence of a mother and
Absolutely.
father. There's nothing
Yes.
that I think impacts a child more than a married mom and dad, and those numbers have just cratered. And when the Great Society first started, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who you cite often, was
Yeah.
concerned about the rates of out of wedlock births in the black community, and they're now worse across the board in all communities than they were back then. Um, so, what what do you think? It seems like there is some recognition of this. And perhaps we're a week away from the election. We've seen some real positive things with this election. Do you think there's a reawakening and a pushback of some of these things finally after all these years?
I do. In fact, I now believe that my optimism has an empirical basis,
Yeah.
and it is the following. It is the following. Um, we know for a fact, for instance, that the trans issue is now deeply troubling to
Hmm.
people left and right in substantial numbers, Micah. Whether you're a progressive or a conservative, it is probable that if you have a daughter who is in sports, you do not
Hmm.
want by this. These are reliable surveys of parents. You do not want boys in girls' sports. You do not want men in women's
Hmm.
sports. We had that sobering moment in the Olympics where a woman was boxed in the face,
Yeah.
and of a sudden, people who theoretically, had defended this, of a sudden had to view it and say, "Wait a minute." I'm not sure that that's exactly my
Hmm.
position, but I think there are many other things that are shards of hope.
Hmm.
School choice,
Yes.
magnet schools, charter schools, the explosion of homeschooling.
Hmm.
We now in America, and of course these statistics vary a bit, but we probably have over 4 million young people who are being homeschooled. So I think that, and there are many other, factors that I think are great in culture. We of a sudden, you can go to the movies. There are good
Hmm.
films that are being made.
Hmm.
There's good television that is being made. This didn't come from nothing. It's coming from a demand. And there are people of goodwill, many of whom share our worldview, some of whom don't. But if they're married and they have children, they think about some of the issues
Hmm.
raised in Stumbling Toward Utopia in a way that most of their progressive counterparts of yore simply did not recognize the implications of. And I want to say something that I think is really important, which is that government is not going to save a marriage. Government is
Hmm.
not going to tuck a child into bed at night. So I am not suggesting, even though I worked 10 years in the Senate and nearly 8 years at the White House, I'm not suggesting that if we can just get our politics right, then we'll solve the social issues. Because I believe, Micah, very strongly that everything we're talking about and stumbling toward utopia is rooted in this, that for all of the rightful concerns we have over the economy and the border and wokeism, etc., that I believe firmly that the biggest issue facing our country is a spiritual crisis
Mm-hmm.
of the first order. And government can make that spiritual crisis worse, please trust me, but it cannot resolve it. And so,
Mm-hmm.
if we want to truly address the cultural and public policy issues in our great state and in our great nation, we have to ask ourselves, as great nations do, how do we address profoundly this spiritual crisis? Because it is a corrosive thing on all the institutions that we care about most.
We're talking with Tim Goeglein. He's with Focus on the Families in Washington, D.C. in their Government Relations Office. He's not far from the U.S. Capitol. Tim, I know you're very busy. I want to ask you two more quick questions. One of the things that comes through this book that I thought is, I guess, concerning to me as a man, as a Christian, and as a father, is how these programs really undermine manhood. And it's not in your book, but you probably wrote it before this happened. One of the most astonishing things happened this election. I don't know if you heard about it, but there was a campaign event called White Dudes for Harris. And South Bend, Indiana mayor, former South Bend mayor, Pete Buttigieg spoke, and he made the comment that abortion makes men more free. And I was stunned to hear someone on the left admit what you and I have been thinking for decades, that some of these policies, abortion, the pill, cohabitation, other things, welfare, really allow men to be irresponsible. And it's shocking that a lot of those things come under the term women's rights or feminism, but it really makes men bad characters. And you have this in your book. Can you address that a little bit? Am I off base?
No, I actually believe you're directly on base, and I think every remarkable empirical survey, left and right, confirms it. That we are facing a gigantic national crisis over this ongoing debate about what is a man and what is a
Mm-hmm.
woman.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should all be extremely sobered that
Mm-hmm.
that the newest Supreme Court justice, at a pivotal moment in
Yes.
her confirmation, was asked, and by the way, Micah, this is very important to know, she was told twice that she was going to be asked this question before she was asked it. It wasn't a surprise. She was told twice and then finally asked publicly, can you define what is a woman? And she essentially said, no, she couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we all know that she can. But
Right.
what we're talking about now is a cultural filter among progressives that denies the ability in all instances to tell the truth. George Orwell, a man of the left, famously said, after really viewing totalitarian communism and its imposition in opposition to truth, said that the first duty of an intelligent man is to restate the obvious. Tell no lies. And so progressivism is ultimately at war with human nature. And it's very important as conservatives that with magnanimity, with grace, with civility, that we tell the truth in this regard over this national debate on gender. I do want to add one thing, if I may, very quickly.
Sure.
I'm an Abraham Lincoln man, and I'm very interested in the 19th century as a portent to so much of what happened and is happening in our country in the 20th and 21st centuries. And, Lincoln was not always an abolitionist. He became an abolitionist, but did not start there. And I
Mm-hmm.
think, and I've done this in my life, I've read extensively and deeply because I've wanted to know for all of the slaveholders and for all those who defended the institution of slavery, North and South, by the way. I wanted to internalize their rhetoric, their arguments, and it's very similar to the pro-abortion
Yes.
culture. It's very similar in the debate that you raise. which is that somehow you can never mention the thing. You can never
Mm-hmm.
talk directly about the thing. You have to create euphemisms and talking points. It's a kind of Olympian view that ultimately projects smugness and condescension. That somehow there's an Olympian view that progressives have, and that they somehow just over time need to enlighten all the rest of us. And ultimately that is a negation of the truth, the natural law that informs good public policy. Eventually, Lincoln came to say, and I think rightfully so, that what's the problem with slavery? Well, it's immoral and it's unjust. And I think
Mm-hmm.
we can say both the same thing about those of us who are pro-lifers, and we know that we're on the right side of history.
Yes. Well, Tim, thank you so much. The book is called Stumbling Towards Utopia. My last question, I should have asked you this beforehand, Tim. Where can people get your book and buy your book? Where would you like them to go? Because I highly recommend this. I enjoyed reading it. It's not a long read, but it's a very educational, very well written, and excellent book called Stumbling Toward Utopia. How can people get this? What's your preferred way for them to buy the book?
Thank you so much. It's widely available everywhere that people buy books online.
Okay.
And as a lover of books myself, I have a number of places that I like to go. And so wherever people find it
Okay.
most convenient, I'm very pleased to say it's widely available.
Well, you've made me want to read your other 3 books. What are those books, real quickly, and I'll let you go. But for my own pleasure, what were your other books you've written?
I'm very honored you would ask. The first one is a memoir called Man in the Middle: Faith and Politics in the George W. Bush Era.
Okay.
I mentioned that I worked in the White House for nearly 8 years. I was President George W. Bush's point man in the faith community, the think tank, and public policy communities as a special assistant. And I write at length about the relation of faith and public life in America, and then with specificity where the era that we are currently in, how we as Christians should think deeply about this very important relationship, and uniquely, I think, to America, the idea of Christianity in the public square. And the second book is called American Restoration, and it's a series of snapshots, as it were, that look at the way specifically to restore our country, to restore the Constitution, to restore the family, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's very commodious to the AFA community. The third book is one of my favorites. It's called Toward a More Perfect Union. It makes the moral and cultural case for teaching the great American story, and why civic and historic and religious literacy really matter to the idea of a great constitutional republic. And the fourth one is Stumbling Toward Utopia, which you're holding in your hand, and which I hope everybody will enjoy and read.
Well, I do too. It's a great book, Stumbling Toward Utopia. By the way, it's Goeglein, Tim Goeglein, Stumbling Toward Utopia. Look it up online. It's a phenomenal book. It's worth every penny, and it's a easy read, but it's a very educational read too. Tim, it's good to see you. Thank you for joining us today. I know you're very busy, but I appreciate your time joining us today.
It's a real joy to be with you. God bless you, Micah, and all of the great folks at AFA of Indiana. I really appreciate this, and many blessings.
Well, thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Again, please get Tim's book, Stumbling Towards Utopia. This really captures a lot of what we do at American Family Association in terms of public policy, advocacy at the State House, education, parental rights. The mission of AFA really lines up with this book, and it's such a joy to read it, Stumbling Toward Utopia. Please go out, search for that. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I'm Micah Clark with American Family Association.